Now, I can't see the future, but my video about my concerns about attacks on our power grid seems eerily prophetic, unfortunately. Now, just before Christmas, a few weeks ago, I published a video about my concerns regarding two different types of attacks on our local power grid in Washington state. The first was political policy attacks, largely coming from Governor Inslee and the more extreme fringe of the Democratic Party and special interests. But the second part was the physical sabotage which has been occurring at local power substations, concentrating on our state, but also happening in other places in America. Now, if you live in Pierce County and you lost your power on Christmas Day, you were probably the victim of what appears to have been a coordinated effort to take down 4 power substations all at the same time. Now, 2 of the substations were managed by Puget Sound Energy, which is a private utility in the Pacific Northwest, and the other 2 stations were operated by Tacoma Public Utilities. Now, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office had provided a map of the 4 substations. You can kind of see how close together they are. And you can see what a few of them look like just by going to Google Maps. You can see here and even this one here. I mean, these look like power substations that many of us drive by every day. Now, fortunately, they just arrested the 2 idiots who apparently did this. And for that, we should all be thankful. Because unfortunately, though, this specific series of attacks doesn't really appear to be what I was warning about in my last video. But let's discuss what happened and what appears to have happened here recently in Pierce County. First, this Matthew Greenwood, who is 32 years old, and actually Jeremy Cran, who's 40. Both of these guys are from Puyallup, and they were arrested December 31st. And they face charges of a conspiracy to damage energy facilities and possession of an unregistered firearm. Now, just in case you're wondering, you can get 20 years in prison for a conspiracy to damage energy facilities. And, of course, the illegal possession of short-barreled rifles and even this kind of cheesy makeshift suppressor, that's not going to help their case. And these 2 geniuses apparently thought that this was actually a smart thing to do so that they would break into these, they would shut down the power grid, and then they would break in these local businesses and steal the cash registers when the power was out. And they also helpfully kept their cell phones on the whole time so that they could make it super easy for law enforcement to arrest them. Now, one thing working in their favor is that they're not wearing MAGA hats, and they don't appear to be Republicans necessarily, and they just appear to be basic criminal scumbags. So if it does turn out that they're just criminals, then I expect them to get the soft touch and released early back into the community so they can keep up their crime spree, hopefully not at power grids. Now, I'll point out in my last video on the subject that I indicated that one partial solution for the problem of unprotected power substations would be actually to have more video surveillance by local neighbors so that those videos could be used to identify the saboteurs. In this recent arrest, well, we're likely to get a lot more details in the near future. Video images of these guys combined with the cell tracking data clearly helped to catch them. And even with Washington State's kind of soft on criminals program that's currently in place, I expect these guys will and they should face some real time in prison. Now, I also want to point out that the original reporting on these clear acts of sabotage on Christmas Day, which, by the way, it appears that they've cost the utilities millions of dollars, were falsely reported as burglaries originally. That was the default position that the media took by many of the local and in particularly the more corporate media. Additionally, several early reports attempted to create this mythical inspiration and motivation behind these attacks, like the never-ending claim that, of course, white nationalist racists must have been involved. I mean, you know, the usual suspects, because the only acceptable villains left in a truly wokester world has to be those guys. And but before the recent arrests, right after the attacks that had happened in Pierce County, the Seattle Times here actually committed an accidental act of journalism, which has been distressingly rare in recent years. And they wrote a pretty decent article on the problem of power grid vulnerability to active sabotage, and I've linked to it down below. The article points out that while most acts have not resulted in arrests, there have been a few people who have been arrested across the country. That includes like a Utah man who hated fossil fuel and he thought destroying power substations promoted his cause. You kind of have to think Ted Kaczynski without the bombs or the deaths. And some other crazies who, just like the geniuses, that they're apparently planning their power substation attacks online so that everybody could actually see just how brilliant they were, and of course what made their future arrests a lot easier as well. Now, I'm going to reiterate my original concern that I expressed in my last video on this subject, and I believe that these recent local events further emphasize the vulnerability and the problem that we face in our state, not to mention our nation, on this subject. And first, it doesn't matter what type of loons and organized crazies are attacking our power grid. Whoever they are, they need to be stopped, they need to be caught, and they need to be put in jail for at least as long as they're jailing people for parading without a permit in D.C., for example. Unfortunately, I fear the political bias in our current judicial system is so skewed that the political affiliation of the people doing this will have a lot more to do with whether they're properly punished or not. But that is a longer topic on the deficiencies in the political bias in our judicial system, better addressed in a different video. Now, secondly, it is terrifyingly obvious that our electrical grid is way more susceptible to willful sabotage than our political leadership or the general public seem to understand. I mean, if these two criminal geniuses are able to take out 4 substations in a morning, shutting down power to 15,000 people for a day, destroying millions of dollars of equipment just to steal a few bucks from the 5 and dime next door, think about how much more damage can be done by dedicated and committed lunatics trying to crash the national inventory system of substation transformers so that the power grid stays down for real, for a much longer time than just Christmas Day. And it doesn't matter if it's some type of offshoot of the eco-terrorists group who have tended to congregate, unfortunately, and they seem to be inspired in our Pacific Northwest. And now these groups have committed many acts of local arson in the past, and some have been convicted of these crimes. Maybe Antifa is just getting bored with burning down courthouses and taking over neighborhoods in Seattle or Portland. Maybe it is a bunch of loons who somehow think the world is a better place without electricity. Or scariest of all, and I think this is scariest of all, maybe it could be teams of saboteurs supported by foreign governments who see this tactic as an effective way to hurt America without a lot of cost or exposure. It really won't matter to you or I which group of nuts or fanatics decide to turn off the power for a long, long time. We're all going to suffer, regardless. And it would be better for everyone, not just us, but for everyone, if we don't have that experience in the first place. We can still prevent this, or at least take some practical steps to reduce the harm caused by this escalating tactic. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned in my last video, 2022 had the largest number of attacks on our power grid substations ever recorded in our nation's recent history, a substantial % increase over the previous high. We experienced at least 110 attacks nationwide like this just this last year in 2022, and it appears to be escalating every year over the past few years. Now, we can take practical steps to better protect these facilities. And it does start, I think, with serious investments in infrastructure, which harden the local substations just a little bit better. This isn't going to stop serious saboteurs, but at least it could stop idiots like these 2 guys that were just arrested in Puyallup from doing this kind of damage so easily. And, of course, we can demand that our political class stop squandering our future and money on esoteric, stupid stuff and maybe divert some of the tax resources into practical solutions like this. Now, I know, asking politicians who spend most of their time trying to craft schemes to restrict your freedom and liberty while squandering as much of your life energy, also known as your money, on stupid stuff sounds like a recipe for failure. And it might be. I mean, we still need to demand practical solutions to real-world problems and hope we can divert at least some of our wasted resources that our bureaucrats and politicians seem to lose or squander or just steal every day to go to something that's actually better and more productive. I believe keeping the lights on and living in a modern world is more important than whatever goofy scheme that they're cooking up right now instead in Olympia or the other Washington and D.C. Now, obviously, I'm concerned about the supply chain and outsourced manufacturing of the transformers in particular. I believe that we'd be well served to manufacture a larger percentage of these in America or nearby rather than in India or Europe, where a large percentage of them come from today, at least the larger ones. And if you study up on the manufacturing process and the quality control needed to produce a good product of this caliber, these are items that really should be made here, and having control over this inventory and supply chain seems to me a much wiser approach. It's much better than having an unknown multi-year lead time from overseas suppliers while vandals and saboteurs are basically burning up the existing inventory in our country. Now, finally, the personal steps that you can and should take haven't really changed. As any Boy Scout can tell you, always be prepared. Everyone should have a plan for how they plan to live without power for an extended period of time. It doesn't have to be saboteurs, it could be an earthquake, it could be something else, but at least you want to have a basic way to stay warm, fed, watered, sheltered, and protect your family if something bad actually happens. Now, this might involve having some conversations with your neighbors and nearby families so you can work together in case of emergency. I think that's wise. And don't presume that somebody else is going to come and save you. They might be very busy or unable to get to you for a while, or they just may be incompetent. This is government after all. And as I stated in my last video, this is another real practical step, that if you live near one of these substations or on a home that's on a road that leads to one of these substations, put out your own security cameras with backup power supplies on your property facing the road or the power station itself, so that you can be part of the solution to catch the bad guys if they decide to attack your local power station. Now, I don't know how much of the video surveillance used to catch these two guys from Puyallup was private, but it certainly can't hurt, and it's got to make the law enforcement side of it a little bit easier. Now, I hope that my concerns are unfounded completely, and I hope nothing like my concerns ever materializes. But hope isn't much of a plan. It is important for us to face the reality of the challenges that actually face us today. A lot of things can go wrong, and we can still muddle through various basic crises. But if you actually lose your power grid in the modern world, that has far more immediate and significantly damaging long-range impacts on our lives than most other practical problems that we might face. A lot of people are worried about things that aren't going to impact their life much at all. So if we can prevent it from happening, or in the worst case scenario, at least be prepared to survive the challenge, I think we'll all be better off. Because remember, the future does belong to those who show up. I say it all the time. And it's much better to be part of showing up and recognizing that that's not just showing up to deal with your local politicians. That should include being prepared for whatever life or our clueless politicians throw at us in the future. Now, I plan to pay attention to this topic as it develops in the future. Hopefully, I won't have much to report over the next year. So, thank you very much for watching. Feel free to share with others.